What most people don't understand about suicidal ideation is how hella convinced we have to be to stay on this earth. Some days even want to stay. It's not enough to tell us that we'll burden someone if we leave, as often as we think we'll burden someone if we stay. Ideation is the double-edged sword we never asked for. Then again, we never asked to be alive either. Ideation is the pendulum that swings from one alternate universe of darkness to another. Convince us of an alternate universe of light that exists out there. With less cliches this time, with more cliches we can be proud of, with more natural prayers, with no empty prayers at all. Convince us of a future that exists for us without the pressure to have to even think of one. Convince us of possibilities without throwing barriers in the same breath. Hear us. Commend us for our survival without us having to experience the threat of a disappearance in the first place. Need us. No, I mean really need us. Not because it'll make you feel better, but because it'll make all of us feel better. No, I mean really feel better. Like freedom of life without having to give compensation for saving it after failed attempts. Like summer rains that give us the occasional cleanse we desire within the livelihood of the gray. Like being so present, being a blessed gift in of itself that no one had to wrap or rewrap it for us. Mental illness unravels like a mother effer. Convince us that we have the ability to wrap it ourselves. Being alive is so hard. I think about this all the time. Sometimes it helps with my depression, and sometimes it does not. But I think it's something that we've all been reckoning with, living now 2 years into this pandemic. 2 years of isolation, mental health issues, living in a climate that more and more people are starting to recognize is filled with terror and oppression. There are various countries struggling with war. So how do we hold space for all of that and continue to be convinced that it is worth sticking around this very hard place called Earth? I attempted suicide at the age of 15. At the age of 15, I decided that life was not worth living. After my attempt, I needed to find ways, something to cope. Listening to music was hit or miss. I didn't get into therapy regularly until much later. So what would help me release what I was coping with? Apparently, writing about it helped give me that sense of release. I had the opportunity to engage with myself, to spend time with myself. And when I shared these poems with other people, they also realized that I wasn't so bad to hang around with. Look at that. In fact, this has happened so much that I use poetry as a way to connect with people. So as the poet laureate of Portland, Maine, I am required to use poetry and literature as a way to connect with the city's community, as well as the Portland Public Library's resources. And what an amazing opportunity to connect with people, to connect with fellow writers about their mental health. To talk about how mental health affects Black people, trans people, disabled and neurodivergent people, justice system impacted people, incarcerated, formerly incarcerated people, and more of hyphenated identities, whether they were the same as mine or not. When I was a keynote speaker for the first time at the Maine Youth Action Network conference this past November, I shared poems about suicide, grief, and my love for Black people of marginalized genders. After the talk, a 16-year-old Black girl came up to me and said, "Thank you for reading today. As a Black woman of color, it's nice to know that I am not alone." While working with the Telling Room, a nonprofit that works with youth age students across the state of Maine, there was one student that was very adamant in getting her questions answered. She said, "It's nice that writing helped you and everything, but what made you want to hurt yourself like that?" In her mind, killing oneself is incomprehensible. But in my mind, it was my only option at the time. And there's no input or output type of answer when it comes to talking about mental health and livelihood. So instead, we got to have a hard conversation, and it was worth having. After my online inaugural reading, this white person messaged me, and I haven't met her until that night. And she said, "Wow, I loved your reading and how active people were in the chat. I've never seen that type of energy at one of these before. I've never seen such a diverse range of people here before." The Portland Poet Laureate position has been around for 14 years, y'all. That means it took 14 years for them to select a Black trans young person for the role for the first time. That means that it took 14 years for this white person to be exposed to that range of backgrounds and colors in their programming. But what I love about this story, and stories like these, is that how they show how hard being alive is for each of us. And yet, at the same time, being alive becomes just a little bit easier by gathering together. So what do you do that makes life a little easier? And how can you spread that to others? Whatever you decide to do, make sure it doesn't just make those around you feel good, but yourself too. When having suicidal thoughts again, remind yourself of how much it hurt when loved ones attempted. Remind yourself of how much it hurt when loved ones ended. Remind yourself of how when your best friend attempted, you told them that you wanted to run out of poems for the dead. Remind yourself of how you told them that you will not write a poem for them. Remind yourself how your best friend will not write a poem for you. Thank you so much.